Thank you everyone for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on what reporters need to know as school districts plan to spend big with new stimulus aid. I'm Lori Crouch, EWA's Assistant Director. Today we're joined by Shira Kovarik of the Federal Education Group and Michelle Reed, North Shore School Superintendent from Washington State. Let me introduce today's moderator, Mark Lieberman, reporter for Education Week, who covers school finance. And Mark will get the conversation going. Take it away, Mark.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Lori, and thanks to all of you for joining. As Lori said, my name is Mark Lieberman. I am the school finance reporter for Education Week. So as you can imagine, the last few months have been very busy for me, as I imagine they have been for many of you as well. School budget season is in full swing, and it's unusually complicated this year for quite a few reasons. One of the big ones is an unusual array of federal aid coming in various stages throughout the last 14 months or so that will be useful to school districts in a variety of ways. So we want to first kind of just unpack what's going on with this federal aid. What does it look like? What does it mean for schools? And so we'll do that first, and then we'll hear kind of a district level perspective, and we'll dig into some of the complexities. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Shira Kovarik, founder and attorney of the Federal Education Group. Shira, take it away.
It's great to be here with you today, and we'll dive in. I have a little bit of information about me so you can understand sort of the background that I bring to this. I'm a regulatory lawyer. I've been working on U.S. Department of Education programs since 2004. So, we've seen lots of programs come and go, and we work mostly with states and school districts to help them understand how to navigate all of these grant programs and figure out what they can and can't do with the money. So we have also been quite interested and busy with ESSER. So I'm just going to take about 10 minutes to unpack some of what I expect will be influencing how districts spend this money. And the first thing to think about are the timelines. This program is working at totally different timelines than federal programs normally work. And, as you guys are all probably aware, that really messes with how districts are going to plan and spend this money. So the law required that, to the extent practicable, states award the first round of ARP ESSER money as of Monday. So many states did that. There's an opportunity to push that deadline back, which some states did. But basically, districts are getting the money before they're submitting plans to spend that money. And that is very unusual in federal programs, and that's been a hard challenge for states and districts to navigate. You'll see states are working on submitting their plans. At the same time, states are getting data collection available. That's a big, heavy lift on school reopening status. And districts are also in the process of planning. There are two plans that the American Rescue Plan requires. One is a safe return to in-person instruction, and then the second one will actually be this more robust ESSER plan that's going to describe how they're going to spend their ARP money. One thing that I want to say about influencing spending is that there are fairly strict timelines for how this money is spent. And when we think about ESSER, we have to remember that there are actually three separate grants. It's all the same program, but there are three separate grants, each of which has its own spending timeline. And this is going to influence how districts spend and allocate these resources across years. So all three of the grants can be used back to expenses starting on March 13th, 2020. That was the official date of the state of emergency for the pandemic. But each one of them have different spending timeline and end dates. So that first round of money, districts have to obligate that money by September 30th, 2022. And what obligate means is that's sort of your last day to enter into any sort of legal obligation that's going to basically require payment. So your last day to enter into a contract, your last day to have an employee work and get paid with ESSER funds. And then there's only a short time after that to actually then spend down your money. You can see here districts have about 90 days to do all of their spending and submit their financial reports to the state, and then the state has 120 days to actually spend down the money. So the money is basically gone from CARES by January 2023. And then you can see each one of the programs has its own deadlines. And so you can see that the ARP ESSER money, for all intents and purposes, the programming is going to be wrapped up by September 30th, 2024. There might be some payout that takes us through January 2025, but then that money is gone. That's a really short window. It feels long, but if you think about the kinds of things we might expect districts to do, like buy curriculum or hire staff, those are things that create ongoing obligations into future years that might be hard for districts to sustain. And so these timelines are going to be front of mind of what can they accomplish in this short deadline without having to create ongoing financial obligations that they might not be able to sustain. This is also going to be hugely influential for construction projects. There are delays in when those construction projects can even start up because of materials and labor shortages. So that's going to be something else districts are balancing. So a couple things to keep in mind about spending. All 3 ESSER grants can be spent on the same activities. Even though it's 3 separate grants, they're all can be used for the same thing. But what you have to remember practically is that states are going to draw down the oldest available money first. So even though ARP ESSER money technically was awarded to many districts this week, it's going to be a long time before we see that money getting spent. We might see some of it around learning loss, but for the most part, you're going to see that states are having districts spend down CARES money first, CURSA money next, and then ARP money. So as you're thinking about it, as you're thinking about monitoring ESSER spending, it's really important to think about all of ESSER and not just the American Rescue Plan. Another thing that's going to influence spending is the fact that there are rules outside of ESSER that apply to ESSER spending. And you'll see I put some of them up here. These are federal regulations and laws that are not specific to ESSER, but will apply to ESSER funds. And those rules can sort of make certain spending choices harder than others. So for example, if you're going to use ESSER money to buy something as a school district, you have to follow federal procurement rules, which might be more restrictive than your local rules, and that might disincentivize doing that kind of contracting. This is going to be really, really important when it comes to construction, because there are a whole bunch of federal construction rules that come along with spending ESSER dollars that you won't find in the ESSER law itself. But, you know, for example, states now have to review and approve construction plans, which is not something states are used to doing, nor do many states feel like they have the capacity to do. So that might be a disincentive to construction. So those are just all things that districts and states are going to have to balance. Another thing that is going to be on our radar screen is the ARP maintenance of equity requirement. I won't go through it. We're still waiting for more guidance from the department. But basically, you'll see there are limits on how much school districts can cut their spending in their poorest schools for 2022 and 2023. And that could affect not just spending, but programming. So one thing that we'll keep an eye on is the extent to which these rules are interpreted to sort of incentivize status quo. So for example, because we have to maintain both FTEs and overall per pupil spending in our poorest schools, it might be a challenge for a district to say, hey, maybe I don't want to have as many paraprofessionals. I want to spend that money on more school counselors. I can't buy as many school counselors with the money I was spending on paraprofessionals, so my overall spending might stay the same, but my FTE count might change. And so that's something I can't do. So these are things we want to keep an eye on, that at a time that we're incentivizing sort of broad thinking around how we deliver services to students, how some of these technical fiscal rules might influence what we do with the money. Another thing to think about is that there are fiscal rules outside of ESSER that are going to affect how districts choose to deploy funds. So you might see these maintenance of effort provisions in other programs limit where we put ESSER dollars and how we budget state and local dollars. So one thing to really keep in mind as you're watching this is to remember that the budget is a whole big strategic thing. And so if you want to see the influence ESSER is having, you don't just want to look at how you're spending ESSER funds, you want to see other parts of the budget. So for example, going back to my point about construction, and it might be hard to do construction with ESSER, even though that's an exciting area of purchase. What you might see is districts spending ESSER funds on things that look boring, but that's in order to free up state and local funds so that they can do that state and local construction, which will feel more flexible. So when you're thinking about ESSER spending, it helps to think about the budget holistically. So I know that was a lot, but I look forward to answering your questions when we get to the Q&A.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that overview, Shira. And I think that one of the obvious takeaways from that is that there's a great deal more complexity in understanding the impact of this federal stimulus on schools than simply thinking about it in terms of schools getting an amount of money, a dollar amount of money, and deciding what to spend it on. There's a great deal of rules and structures that sort of dictate where that is going, and I think that's something that reporters ought to be really paying a lot of attention to, and not sort of sticking kind of maybe a more superficial understanding. So to help with that rather challenging goal, we've brought a superintendent to tell us from a district perspective what's going on with federal money. So Michelle Reed is superintendent at the North Shore School District in Washington State. And Michelle, I'm wondering if you can tell us a few things about the federal stimulus. First layer, just kind of tell us how much money you got from the 3 rounds of federal relief, but more importantly, tell us about sort of the how that looks relative to your overall budget and what challenges and opportunities the arrival of these funds creates for your district.
So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Shira. This is really a top of mind topic for sure, and I appreciate folks taking the time this afternoon to jump on and learn more about it. For us here in the North Shore School District, because our state used Title I as the decision maker for distribution of funds, which I think it's rooted in equitable principles. In this case, however, because we didn't, how do I say this? I think we could have had a more thoughtful process in terms of thinking about headcount as well as simply percentages. Our district actually is only receiving just over $7 million, and we're a district of close to 24,000 students. In contrast, Seattle will be receiving $145 million, and they're twice our size. I don't know about you all, but the math of 7 million to 145 million with twice the size is significant. So one of the challenges we have here in our state is that we have 295 school districts who all received their federal monies based on the percentage of their free and reduced lunch students. Whereas we have a head count of more students than many smaller districts, because we're so large, the percentage is smaller, which drove less money, actually only about $326 per student compared to close to $8,000 per student in some other districts for students that are at the same poverty level. We find that really challenging in working with our communities and our families, right? So I think the, if you will, intent to equitably distribute funds created its own set of inequities. So I think it's just bearing that in mind as we think about what different communities are going to do with their funds. And Mark, I don't know if you want to interrupt at any point, but so that was point one. Point two, I think that asking for really deep engagement with our community, and we had 6 weeks to develop our plan. So any kind of deep engagement and deep understanding of the guidelines, so we're really thoughtful, has been on an accelerated timeline like nothing I've seen before, to be honest. You talk about accelerating learning. This has been accelerating a budget planning process, which rightly so, right? We're in a pandemic. So the other thing I think we were chuckling about just before we came on live is that new information has just dropped again about guidelines, and our board actually had to approve our plan last Monday to comply with our state guidelines. So it feels sometimes, it's a little metaphoric for this entire pandemic, that sometimes we're being asked to make decisions with guidelines and directives that can be at times conflicting, complex, not timed for the decisions. Having said all of that, we're really grateful that we're going to be receiving funds, particularly at this time. And we're really also grateful that we have several years in which to expend them. I think that's really critical. And we're having opportunities to look at what are initiatives in the short term to support sort of our inequitable educational outcomes that we've seen over the last year and a half. But we also don't want to forget that we've had historic inequities in educational outcomes for students that this money alone likely won't transform, but perhaps will give us a great launching spot for future budget decisions. Because at the end of the day, right, if you want to know what systems value, follow the money. And anyhow, I'll stop there, Mark. I'm sure there's more I can add. But anyhow, there you go.
Absolutely. Well, Michelle, thank you for your candor and talking about kind of the ways that your district has received the funds. You mentioned a couple, you hit on a couple themes that tie to questions I was going to pose even before you asked them. So let me maybe start with the one you mentioned about public comment, because it seems to me there's sort of two different threads running here. One is a very, very short timeline for meaningful engagement with community and other stakeholders who are influencing the budgeting decisions you're making in the short term. Parallel to that, as Shira discussed, there's also quite a bit of time, particularly with the third round of federal funds, to actually obligate and spend them. And so I'm wondering, and maybe I'll start with Shira on this. You know, to what extent can these plans that districts are being required to make on this very, very short timeline, like the one Michelle just described, to what extent can they be changed after the fact? To what extent should reporters be looking for, even expecting these plans to change and evolve? And sort of how much long-term thinking and planning can go into spending these funds, given both the long deadline for spending them and the short deadline for explaining, at least preliminarily, how they will be spent?
It's a great question, and I think you're going to have different answers. You know, what do we have? You know, however many districts we have in the country, you're going to have different answers for each district. I think as far as the U.S. Department of Education is concerned, the guidance we've seen from them is that they've said, you know, yes, these plans can evolve, especially stakeholder engagement, that you're going to have an initial round. Certainly for those safe return to instruction plans, there's a requirement that districts go back and update them every 6 months through 2023. And so there is some recognition that this is going to change. All that said, there are rules and rules and rules of layers and layers and layers of rules that affect planning and budgeting, some of it federal, some of it state, some of it local. So the extent to which a district can evolve is really going to depend on how easy those rules are to navigate. Some states make it very hard to do budget changes. They have clunky systems. Other places make it much easier. So it's going to be a mixed bag.
Absolutely. And Michelle, I'm wondering if you can talk more about what you know, given that your district is working with a somewhat limited set of funds in comparison to neighboring district, sort of how does that affect your calculations for where the money can go the furthest? Sort of how do you, especially in this short time frame, how do you make those decisions about the ways to sort of invest for the long term, even as you're making these choices in the short term?
Great question, Mark. We do have a strategic plan which has goals and measurements, and we in North Shore use a needs-based resource allocation model which looks at the ROI, or return on investment, of funds expended. So we're looking at data right now from student achievement as well as survey data from students and families in the district to make decisions around what are those programs that with, at this point, as you know, with minimal expenditure over 3 years, will have the largest impact on student health, well-being, and academics.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. And I sort of want to take that and sort of pivot into something related, which is I know that the American Rescue Plan funds, there's a requirement that 20% of those funds be spent on initiatives that address learning loss. Maybe I'll start with Shira on this. Can you talk about sort of what your sense of what the federal government will consider to be an initiative that addresses learning loss? It is theoretically at least a fairly broad category, but are there are districts struggling with being able to determine whether there's something they want to spend money on could be construed as spending that specifically addresses that discrete phenomenon?
Yes, definitely. We are definitely getting those questions. I think there are the sort of the named examples in the law, summer enrichment, after school programming. I think like people can get their minds around tutoring, but we already have started to have some conversation around, well, what if you wanted to, do a teacher effectiveness initiative to help teachers, understand content better so that they can accelerate? How does that fit in? So I think there's some open question for that. The biggest question I am seeing from states and districts, though, is around the requirement that the activities be evidence-based. And the ARP defaults back to the ESEA definition, which has these 4 tiers. The 4th tier is quite flexible, but I don't know that that message is really out there. And one of the things that's really causing concern is that there are different ways of assessing evidence for academic interventions versus social and emotional learning. And so I think people are a little bit worried around how that evidence-based requirement might crowd out things that are less academic, less well-studied, have different evidence base.
Michelle, that's something you're grappling with in your district in particular?
Well, I think we always want to use evidence-based practices, right? I mean, I think if we're thoughtful, we use evidence-based practices and we have program evaluations in place because we start a lot of things and we don't want to have them just continue if they don't add value. So I think that's just good practice. I would also say that to the point around really thinking about initiatives and how to best spend the money, Shira mentioned early on the sustainability of whatever we put into place. And as a superintendent, we look out 4 years in our state. We have to provide a 4-year budget. And if all the money is, let's say there's a cliff after 3 years, we have to, for example, if we were to move to lower class sizes significantly, and then 3 years out, we couldn't support those positions, we're setting ourselves up for really a serious cliff at that point. So I think while we're looking at evidence-based, trying to take stakeholder engagement, and we also have to look at the sustainability on the other end of that. So it's really it's a much more complex task, I think, than it might appear initially. However, of course, in our case, since we have very few funds to expend, we're likely not to get ourselves in as deep water as some folks might, because many districts are actually getting significant amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money. I will also say that as a superintendent, our inboxes, I know I've spoken to many colleagues around the country, our inboxes have been flooded with vendors purporting to have research-based strategies. That reminds me kind of weight loss clinics, right? If you buy into this model and you work on it for 42 days, voila, right? I'm going to look great in a swimsuit this summer. Well, I don't know if all of those are going to carry the weight or have the impact that is intended. So I do have a little concern about some of those aspects, but sustainability is really a key, as well as I think we always want to use research practice.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 points you made there that I want to touch on. One is a note for reporters. What Michelle just mentioned is something I think is really ripe with opportunity for further investigation in terms of companies or vendors coming to schools pitching their products at a time when schools are in a rush to kind of show that they're addressing the pressing challenges that students and families are facing. There was I believe a Kaiser Health News investigation recently about school districts that purchased technology related to air purification and filtration that purported to be using evidence-based tools to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, but upon further investigation, many of these companies were drastically overstating the effectiveness of their products. And that's something that I think is really worth looking out for in the local context, sort of where the money is going, who the third-party providers are, what we know about them, how much research and investigation the district is doing into the companies before signing on with them. I think it's really crucial. The other thing is, Michelle, we made it about 23 minutes into this session before we got to the funding cliff. I feel like, we have to bring it up at least once.
Sorry.
And at least I've been bringing it up at I've been hearing it at every school finance discussion I've been having recently. This is something that I know that many districts are concerned about, especially if the people working on school finance in those districts were working in the aftermath of the 2008 recession, when the funding cliff was a really pervasive and deeply challenging issue that arose. Basically, the phenomenon of schools investing in programs or resources or even people who they lose the ability to fund after a period of time because the money they were using to spend on them runs out. Shira, what are you hearing about how concerned districts are about that this time around? Do you get the sense that some maybe have learned lessons from that previous experience, and are there aspects of the way that this money is rolled out that maybe makes that concern less pressing or more pressing? I'm wondering sort of what your read on that situation is.
So I think it's a huge concern. I think what you'll find sort of as we're sort of getting the preliminary account, right? Like as people are sort of spending down CARES, is you probably will see a lot of money that went into sustaining budget for shortfalls that arose last year. So you might see a lot of this early money sustaining budgets and investing in staff. And I think people are only just now starting to have the more strategic conversations around, okay, now that we've sort of stayed afloat and we're looking out a couple of years, how are we going to do that? And I know sustain everybody's radar screen. I think one thing that will be interesting, and Michelle, I'd love to hear how you think about that. I think a lot of times in education, we tend to add on and add on and add on and add on, and we don't rethink what we were doing. And so one of the things that I'm hoping districts will take the opportunity to think about is, okay, but like, what have I been spending on up to now? What can I pilot with my ESSER money and then swap it out? One of the things that we do a lot of writing about is thinking more strategically about existing federal funding sources like IDEA and Title I, and those programs are often a lot more flexible than people think they are. So like if we do a tutoring program with ESSER dollars that we really love and we want to sustain, we can do that in our lowest performing schools and our poorest schools with Title I money. If we want to invest ESSER money in inclusive classroom practices, we can sustain a lot of that with IDEA, and people don't always know that. So, on top of everything else we're asking districts to do, there's some chance to revisit misperceptions around myths and misperceptions around existing funding sources. It's not a great answer, but it's one thing we're keeping an eye on.
Yeah, no, I think it's critical, right? And sometimes the initiatives revolve around the people. You move to a new district, and that's what X does, right? Well, but is that where the organization, is that still in alignment with our goals for this year? Because if we have, really more than 5 major goals for the year, we have none, right? Because we can't really stay focused. So I think it's always a good idea to winnow collectively and collaboratively to say, this is our theory of action this year. These are the resources we have to allocate, and resources aren't always money. They're also time. It's time, talent, and treasure, right? Like you have to have people that have the time and the bandwidth to really be thoughtful about the strategic theory of action we're working on. So you're absolutely right, Shira. We can't keep layering the work. It has to be integrated and follow coherence with the strategic plan. And we too often, I think, have organizational, ADHD in some ways. But I think this process, although it's unprecedented in its acceleration, if we're thoughtful, it can really benefit us. However, if we're not thoughtful and maintain that sustainability, I think we lose trust with both our internal community within a district and our external community, because we can't start and stop and start and stop in a non-predictive manner. So I just think those are key pieces in thinking about this right now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. And you know, it's interesting. Something you said just reminded me of something similar that I heard from a district CFO in Wisconsin, I believe, a couple of days ago. We were talking about the federal proposal to invest in the nation's school infrastructure. Current proposals for $100 billion in grants and bonds to go to school districts on top of all the money that we have been talking about this whole time. Of course, that proposal is still very much up in the air in terms of how likely it is to pass. This particular CFO was sort of making the point to me that you know, he's concerned that you know, or he sort of wants to be sending the message to, you know, colleagues in his field that you know, it's important for schools to be finding ways to prioritize infrastructure projects, capital projects, building improvements in the budget, you know, within their limited means, even, you know, even setting aside the possibility of federal funds. And this is something we know nationwide has been a really difficult thing for schools to fund, to find the capital to invest in these long-term projects. But we also know that there's kind of an urgent need for it. You know, I've been writing recently about the significant percentage of school districts around the country that are in some state of relatively severe disrepair. And sure, I mean, you were mentioning kind of challenges with spending this money on construction, particularly in the context of at least the potential for additional money on infrastructure. I guess I'm wondering how much you are seeing districts thinking about long-term approaches to investing and improving their buildings, and sort of what the complications with doing that might be.
No, this is probably the number one question we've been getting since the initial emergency set in. People are very interested, and I think there are several things driving that. So the first thing is, you know, you can't use traditional U.S. Department of Education programs on construction. So Title I, Title II. So this is just sort of like, people are like, oh, I can think out of the box with this money. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I know we think about this as a long time to spend money, but September 30th, 2024 is that there are very few things that you can actually spend money on in that time frame that doesn't create ongoing sustainability challenges. And so I think a lot of people are looking at construction as something sort of short term that I can do within that time frame. But we didn't talk about it. The department dropped, Michelle alluded to it, they dropped a 65-page guidance document out today, and just from my very quick skim, they discourage new construction. So how that's going to be interpreted in the field and what that's going to mean, it's very challenging. I will say there are a ton of very restrictive federal rules that come along with paying ESSER dollars, prevailing wage rules, environmental impact studies, things like that, that make it potentially a longer time frame that we just might not have time to do it, quite frankly.
Yeah. And I mean, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just share quickly. We have 3 cities that our district encompasses. And one of the strategies we've used is we've partnered with our cities to utilize their ESSER money as well. Cities are getting, I don't know if it's called ESSER money, but it's federal aid connected to COVID. And we've used that to support tutoring and other, we're looking at, because we had, again, less of an allocation, we're working with our cities to partner to create programs that might support this work as well. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for linkages across, if you will, jurisdictions if those relationships are solid and in place.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, sort of in response to everything we've been talking about. I mean, one theme that I think really jumps out to me is just how complex and frankly exhausting a lot of the sort of bureaucracy involved here seems to be. As someone who's merely reporting on it, I find it sometimes exhausting even to think about. And I'm not, I'm not in charge of a district, and by extension, it's many students. I guess I'm wondering for both of you, like, what's your sense of how district leaders are coping with just the complexity of how to spend in this moment, and sort of how to invest the resources in the right ways? Sort of the human toll that these opportunities and challenges are sort of taking as this work continues.
Shira?
Well, so Okay, so I think district leaders are rising to the occasion because that's what they do, right? They have this money, they have their students. I mean, just forget what I do for a profession as a mother of 3 school-age kids. It's amazing what people have been able to do in such a short amount of time. I think, though, we have to be aware of and have grace for all of the competing challenges. I hear a lot of voices pushing districts to think innovatively, to solve all the world's problems. But at the same time, I hear from districts, someone's going to audit me at some point, and they're right. If you spend more than $750,000 in federal funds, you get this thing called a single audit. People are going to be coming and looking, and not just the public scrutiny. I think district superintendents are very used to defending their decisions from, to the community and dealing with media stories. But I think there's this big unknown about what is all of the bureaucratic monitoring and oversight going to look like. And if you take the opportunity to spend innovatively and take the risk, is that going to come out to bite you 3, 4, 5 years down the line when the rest of us are all looking somewhere else? And that absolutely happened with ARA, and people are feeling very gun shy about that. And I have to say, the initial round of CARES monitoring from the department was really heavily focused on financial controls, which are important. We want to make sure there's no fraud, waste, and abuse, but we also don't want to scare people out of spending the money. So I think, and I just want to say, in terms of empathy for districts, I can't tell you how unusual it is for states to be pressured to award funds first for plans later. And I think a lot of districts will not spend ARP ESSER funds until they get their states okay on their actual budgets, out of a sense of security.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just agreeing.
Excellent. Okay, I think we're going to throw to some audience questions now. So I'm excited about this, and please continue to send them in. We have some more time, so please do that.
Yes, thanks again, Shira and Michelle. This has been great, and thank you, Mark, for such a great job moderating. Our first question comes from Howard Bloom with the Los Angeles Times. To what extent is there going to be a shortage of qualified teachers and other employees for school systems to hire, and what's being done about that? Even if something's done about it, it seems like might be a time lag before the talent pool catches up.
So I think that what we're looking at right now are even schools of education, and the number of students graduating, and the pipeline is not robust at the moment. I think the work right now in education has never been harder. Our teachers have never worked harder and never felt less visible. The rhetoric out there right now surrounding a number of topics, racial and educational justice, the COVID pandemic topics that are ancillary to that, have really, I think, made it challenging to attract folks to education as well. So I think we have our work cut out for us. It is absolutely the most important profession in the world. All other professions travel through K-12 education. And I think it's something we're going to have to really be attentive to. It's a great question.
So there are 2 things I want to keep my eye on. One is how maintenance of equity ends up playing into some of the questions about teacher pipeline. Because remember, in our poor schools, we have to keep both a certain level of FTEs and a certain level of overall spending. So if we're going to have cuts, but one of the things that one of the biggest drivers of inequitable spending across schools is teacher salaries. So I think it's going to be very important to think about where teacher reductions are happening. So where teachers are exiting, if they get replaced by newer, less well-paid teachers, how that affects maintenance of equity, and how that affects district decision-making about recruitment intention. So that's sort of one set of issues to think about in terms of where the teacher jobs are and how much we have to pay. The other thing I want to think about is innovative strategies for adding teaching capacity without creating ongoing burdens. So for example, trying to use ESSER funds to convert existing paraprofessionals to help them get teacher certification, so that you're sort of not starting from scratch, but you're using like a grow your own within your own pipeline, and similar for inclusive practices, encouraging general education teachers to get special ed certification so we can do more inclusive practices that maybe help with how we deploy teachers.
Great answers. Next question is really interesting. Ashley Sloboda from the Journal-Gazette in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Are there common misconceptions that would be good for reporters to clear up regarding these federal COVID relief dollars? Here, parents advocating for mask choice have spoken at school board meetings, claiming that the district is keeping the mask mandate to get the federal dollars. I feel like an explainer about this could only be a good thing. So any comments on that?
Lori, I would say that there are 50 states, right, in the continental United States, and I think that we've got 50 different governors' perspectives, state health department perspectives. We in our district have 2 county health departments that don't always agree. So I think clarity around what our health recommendations and what our budget priorities and funds to support academic and emotional well-being would do nothing but help, right? So since we're speaking to reporters, the clearer that communication can be, the better, I think, for everybody.
So I love this question because I spend my career busting myths around, what federal rules do and don't require. And I think one of the things that's super interesting and hard to write about is how these myths come about and sort of the unintentional ways we incentivize these myths. So for example, around mask mandate, there is no federal requirement that you have a mask mandate to get this money, but districts do have to describe in their plans how they are complying with current CDC guidelines. And if you look at the criteria, it says correct and universal mask wearing, but et cetera, et cetera. Now, buried in fine point, the department says these aren't required. We just want you to describe what you're doing if you're doing it, but that's not how it always gets translated, right? People see a box in an application form and they're like, I guess to get the money, I have to write about how I'm using masks, so I have to have a mask mandate. Like this happens. We see this with like federal privacy rules. There's a wide, just a universal misperception that like you can't notify parents if there's lice in the classroom because of FERPA. It's not true. You can't say, this child has lice, but you can certainly say there's been a lice outbreak, but people don't know that because the rules are so complicated. So I love that your attention is even on that. So it's great.
I thought we could go an hour without talking about life.
Great. The next question, and actually, Mark, you might want to offer some advice here. Carmen Nesbitt, education reporter at the Flint Beat in Flint, Michigan. My first question is, once the plans are submitted to the state, will those be public or will I need to FOIA? Second question. My district is going to get about $99 million, which has the power to totally transform Flint schools. Any recommendations on how to report the progress over time? It's a bit overwhelming.
Sure, do you want to take the first one? Whether it'll be public or whether the reports will be public or not?
So the one thing I can say for sure is, so remember, districts have to do 2 plans. There's the Safe Return to Instruction and Continuity of Services plan. That's the first one that's due. That one does have to be made public. It has to be posted to the district's website. The state actually has to post to it. I just want to double check about the actual spending plan if there's a specific rule. So Michelle, I'll let you answer the what can we do well with funds, and I'll chat in the answer to the other one.
Right, and I think that for Flint to receive $99 million obviously is significant, and it even requires, I think, greater thought to not create something that has a cliff 3 years out. But in the short term, envisioning innovative structures, practices, modalities for assessment, instruction, there's huge potential. I think, again, to the earlier question about maintaining a strong pipeline of new educators, we have to maintain sort of a predictable career path as well for folks. So just really keeping an eye on the sustainability is going to be critical.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yes, the LEA ARP ESSER plan does have to be posted to the LEA's website. So you'll find it there.
Great. Yeah, and I was just going to add, I mean, I think in the short term, taking a lot of the lessons from what we've already talked about today in terms of monitoring the district's efforts to reach out to the community. I think one thing that I found really useful in my coverage of school finance is getting in touch directly with chief financial officers or people involved in the business administration within schools, because they often are the most knowledgeable people in the district, sometimes even more so than the district leaders, and certainly often more so than state lawmakers or school board members. To kind of walk you through the district's decision-making processes on the nuanced issues like what Shira was describing in terms of, we're going to spend the money on this boilerplate initiative to free up money from elsewhere. So, I think it is, the last thing I would say is I think it is, this is just general advice for everybody, not just for you, but I think that this is a story that will unfold over really several years. And I think, I think there will be a temptation once, assuming that the pandemic sort of ends, quote unquote, or, once the kind of like the public discourse moves on from the American Rescue Plan to other topics, I think there'll be a temptation to sort of like, forget about what's going on in terms of that money rolling out. But I think sort of thinking of what's happening now as the first stage of a long-term investigation, I think is really worthwhile.
Great. The next question from Nick, forgive me, Nick, if I mispronounce this, Carollo. Can you talk more about the August 24th deadline? Is that for local education agencies to submit their plans to their states? And are those plans that need to be approved by the school boards first or other agencies?
Yeah, so I think that was on my slide. So that August 24th date on my slides, if you pull them down later, you'll see it says estimated. That comes from a requirement. So the U.S. Department of Education put out a set of interim final requirements on ARP ESSER. And one of the things they said was that states have to collect LEA ARP ESSER plans from districts. The state gets to set the deadline, but it has to be within 90 days of when the LEA got its first allocation of funds. Since most states, I think, got their money out on Monday, I just sort of did 90 days hence to get us to August. And if I did the math wrong, then it's solely on me, but that's sort of where that comes from. There are things in the IFR that have to be included, and then states will design it themselves, and then those plans will have to be posted to LEA websites. Each state and district is going to have different rules for what the approval of that is. So the state does have to approve it. The district submits it to the state approves it, and then it's there. Whether or not a district has to get its board approval will depend on state and local rules. It's not a federal requirement, but there might be state and local requirements that the board have to approve it. Michelle, it sounds like that's the case for you.
That's correct.
Okay, another process question from Aaron Allen of the Seattle Medium newspaper. Will there be an RFP process for outside organizations such as nonprofits that deal in education that can offer services beneficial to school districts?
See, this is a great question, and this gets into like all of those hidden influences. So because ESSER is technically federal money, districts will have to follow federal procurement rules, and the federal government defines different thresholds depending on how much a contract is worth, whether, what kind of procurement process it goes through. That may or may not align with local procurement rules. So districts are going to have to go through this sort of balancing, and basically they're going to have to follow the most restrictive rules. So whether or not an RFP is required is going to depend on the amount of money and then on the local rule. So some contracts will, some contracts won't. but this really influences what you spend on, right? Like, because you have to build in an RFP process, and RFP processes can be quite long depending on what your local board rules are. So, you know, we think the money's going to be around for a while, but districts have to make some tough decisions now if they're contracting.
Emily Files, I think she's with Wisconsin Radio or maybe Indiana. Speakers mentioned that needing to rush the public engagement process. What are the public input requirements tied to the money?
So the requirement is around that LEA ARP ESSER plan I mentioned that's going to have to be submitted within 90 days at the outside. States can set sooner deadlines. And there is a requirement that districts engage, and states have to do this as well, but districts have to engage in sort of meaningful consultation with a really wide range of stakeholders in developing that plan. So it's nothing that you would find in the ESSER law itself. It comes from these interim final requirements, which are basically regulations the department put out. But it's a condition of doing that plan. And, you know, stakeholder engagement is super important. It's always hard to balance how meaningful can it be in a short time frame when we're in the middle of a pandemic. But, you know, it's something districts are going to have to balance.
Michelle, did you want to say anything about trying to engage the public?
I think it was a very short timeline by the time we got the template, because it wasn't just meaningfully engaged. We had to meaningfully engage the public on the topics and tenets that the state required us to meaningfully engage the public on. We had to wait to find out what those were and then message those to our community after they were translated. We have 94 home languages spoken in our district. And so making sure we have translated communication in any kind of meaningful way, and then have the plan done in less than 6 weeks to reopen innovative schools that address inequitable gaps in student well-being, I think is, on top of everything else that's happening right now, I think was an ambitious goal.
Great. Here's a question from Roz Edward of the Michigan Chronicle. Is the funding meant to be an incentive to get more teachers in the classrooms? Anybody want to dip their toe in that water?
I don't know what the incentive from the federal government was. I think it's certainly a use for short-term monies, but if it's not sustainable at the end of 3 years, because federal money sunsets, then it's probably not a strategy you want to bank on moving forward unless it's funded.
And Roz was also wondering whether the 99 million was supposed to make up for the water crisis as well as COVID.
I will tell you, Laurie, and I don't know if Shira agrees or not, but a lot of our federal money that was allocated in our state sort of got moved around so that, in other words, some of the shortfalls were replaced with that. So we didn't, I think there's been a lot of interesting, interesting calculations and creative allocations for us budget-wise, but I don't think 99 million could even begin to make up for the water crisis in Flint based on what I've read.
So this goes back to the issue Michelle talked about, which is Congress required that this money be distributed based on each district's relative share of Title I funds. So that 99 million is just a formulaic percentage of ESSER based on what percent Flint gets out of Title I. Now, the reason Congress did that is because Congress tends to think of Title I as a shortcut for communities that are affected by poverty and concentrated poverty. There has been a ton of very interesting writing. Nora Gordon from Georgetown comes to mind about how that the Title I formula actually is not as equitable as we think it is. And she's proposed some other formulas that would have been more equitable, but that's where that 99 million came from.
Great. Mark, is there anything else you want to say in conclusion before we wrap up? And if there's any last minute questions, get them in while Mark is making his wrap up remarks.
Absolutely, and I just sent the Nora Gordon piece that Shira mentioned, and so everyone on the webinar should be seeing that soon. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to thank Shira and Michelle for taking time out of your very busy lives right now to walk us reporters through what's going on with federal money. I think it's really helpful both to get a sense of kind of what the rules and restrictions and guidelines look like, as well as a district level perspective on how this is actually working in reality. You know, I think it offers a reminder to us as reporters. You know, Michelle's story in particular really, I think, reflects that the federal funds are impacting districts in a wide variety of ways. You know, this, and I guess the advice I would give is really to, in your own district or in the districts that you cover, to really look at the money in the context of the district's budget. I've been trying as a practice in the stories that I've been writing about districts and federal relief to, whenever I mention a district and how much money they got from federal stimulus, to also mention how big their annual budget is, as well as the number of students they have. It's even better if you can calculate it out per pupil, because I think to use Michelle's district as an example, I think there's a way to write a headline about a school district receiving $7 million from the federal government that would convince readers who are not paying attention to the intricacies of school finance, to think that the district got just this enormous windfall of money. But when you put that in the context of the district's larger budget, the overwhelming needs and expenses and challenges of the pandemic, and the context of what's going on in neighboring districts that got a lot more, you're telling a much more nuanced story about what's going on that I think really educates the public more so than simply providing a number and kind of leaving it at that. So that would be kind of my advice, a very specific practice to maybe implement in your own reporting, but also hopefully extending that into thinking about these funds in a variety of ways as opposed to in a very narrow context. So I would just say again, thank you to both of you, and thank you to EWA for having me. And I think that's all. So I'll throw it back to Lori.
Okay, we got a couple of complicated questions. Do you all have time to answer one or two of them? Or do you all need to?
I have like 2 minutes, and then I'm got a 1 o'clock I've been holding off. So, but I will give it a shot.
How about you, Shira?
Yeah, I can stay for a few minutes.
Okay. I'm Blake Jones from the Idaho Education News. I'm wondering whether local education agencies will face any federally set repercussions if they fail to post spending plans to their websites, or if they fail to gain plan approval for their plans from the state.
So, believe it or not, the U.S. Department of Education's answered this question about basically these funds are considered state administered funds, which means the federal government gives the money to states who then pass it on to districts. And because the state is serving as this pass through, it has sort of first cut at enforcement practices. So what the U.S. Department of Education has said is it expects the state to monitor local compliance with these rules and take action as appropriate. States have a wide range of enforcement tools. I wouldn't expect to see a state turn off a district's funding if they didn't do the plan, but escalating that could happen in some circumstances. In terms of spending, the reason why these LEA, ARP, ESSER plans are so important is because there's a federal rule that doesn't come from ESSER that says that districts have to spend their money in accordance with their approved plans. So many states are having districts include budgets at the time that they submit these LEA, ARP, ESSER plans, and that's going to be the guideline. And there are sanctions for not spending in accordance. States are going to be monitoring, and they can ask for money back. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Inspector General will be monitoring. Private auditors will be auditing. So there's going to be a lot of eyes on that. So there could be consequences That being said, the federal preference for any kind of enforcement action is audit, sort of cooperative audit resolution. We want this money to be helping kids. We don't want it going back. So, you'll see, enforcement doesn't always mean pay back the money, but all of that is one of the reasons why there is so much pressure on districts as they decide how to spend this money, knowing that 2, 3, 4, 5 years out from now, they're going to have to defend what they did in an audit, and that's a complicated process.
Okay, the final question is from, is it Keen or Kane Turner? Could these federal dollars be used for adult school and continuation schools within school districts?
So it's a great question, and I'm going to give you the caveat that I have not read the department's guidance in full yet, so it's possible they address this. But ESSER funds can be used for anything that would be allowable under the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which supports adult ed programs. And so it is possible that you could see somebody using this money for adult ed. So even though it's called the Elementary and Secondary, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, it can cover adult ed.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we are done. Thank you very much to our panelists, Mark, Shira, and Michelle. We greatly appreciate you carving out time in your very busy schedules. This was incredibly informative. I also want to thank you all for participating in this panel or in this program, and we appreciate you taking time out to join us for this webinar. As the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important for us to improve. So with that, this webinar is concluded. Thanks, you guys.